Hey, my name is Brady,
Hi, I'm Merritt,
and
and
this
this is
is
the
the
Team
Team
Radio
Radio
Podcast.
Podcast. This is our first episode, and today we are going to be talking about the Monaco race weekend that just happened. So let's get to our recap of qualifying. First and foremost, probably the most noteworthy news from qualifying was Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, in 7th place.
That's something new that we've seen from him. We haven't seen him qualify outside of Q3 or outside of P3 in who knows how long.
Forever, it feels like.
We, on the other hand, have a very strong performance from Ferrari with Leclerc on pole, his first time on pole at Monaco.
Home Grand Prix.
Yeah, and we have Carlos Sainz in P4, so also very strong from both of them.
We also had everybody's favorite Aston Martin driver, Sebastian Vettel, P8, making it to Q3, out-qualifying his teammate Lance Stroll, and reminding everybody why he was once a world champion driver.
And speaking of world champion drivers, we have Red Bull with our up-and-coming Max Verstappen in P2, followed by Checo in P9, a little bit farther down than we wanted to see from him, but he's hanging in there, and we're looking forward to a good race from him.
Checo's had a very interesting season, and the discrepancy between his qualifying finish and his race finish definitely, I think, speaks to that.
Yeah.
Speaking of Aston Martin, Vettel's teammate Lance Stroll, disappointed finishing P13, did not make it to Q3 in the qualifying, and Stroll has really kind of struggled to adapt to the new Aston Martin, as has Vettel, but of course Vettel outperformed Stroll today.
And just quickly to give everyone some context, I'm going to go through the top 10 positions. We got Charles Leclerc on pole, Max Verstappen in second, Valtteri Bottas third, Carlos Sainz P4, followed by Lando Norris. We have Pierre Gasly in sixth, Lewis Hamilton in seventh, Seb Vettel in eighth. P9 is Sergio Perez, and in 10th we have Antonio Giovinazzi, who qualified Q3 for the first time.
Congratulations to Giovinazzi. He had a pretty good weekend.
Yeah.
We'll get to him a little bit later. Right now, we're going to move into our next segment, which we like to call Polls and Pit Lanes, where we look at 3 of the best performers of the day and, 3 of the not so good
blunders.
Yeah. And for our first poll of the weekend, we have none other than the race winner, the Dutchman himself, Max Verstappen. He was fantastic all weekend, qualifying P2. Because of the Charles Leclerc drama that we will get into later, Max was actually the first driver in the grid, despite, of course, qualifying P2. But during the race, Max, just set a Monaco record for fastest race ever.
Mm-hmm.
No big deal. This was not only his first podium in Monaco, but of course his first win. So big congratulations to Max there.
Yes, and now he's leading the the drivers' championship.
Yes.
Which is very exciting. And can we talk about how good of a day Max had, really? Like, he would call in on the radio and say, "These tires feel great." I mean,
he was smiling. He seemed to be having just a grand old day at the pier.
A nice little parade around Monaco for him.
And it really was no challenge. I mean, Carlos Sainz, who we will get to in just very shortly, he really couldn't even touch Verstappen throughout the whole race, and Sainz was the only one who even came close.
At one point, we did have Checo, Sergio Perez, for people who don't know his nickname. We had Checo in front of Max after a pit stop, but that did not last long.
No, not at all.
So on to our next poll, we have Vettel, who started the race at P8, ended P5, which is impressive for Monaco, where it's very hard to overtake in these big cars. And Vettel really had a great performance. He was tailing Hamilton for much of the first half of the race, and then was very smart with the timing of his pit stop. He went in with Pierre Gasly following Valtteri Bottas, who we will get to in a second. And because of very speedy mechanics on his end, had a faster pit stop than Gasly and was able to get out just in front of him, securing him that P5 spot.
Yeah, you mentioned it. Of course, Monaco is a very low overtake type of race, but you really can't do it a whole lot better than Vettel did coming out of that pit lane to take over Gasly.
Gotta take the opportunities when you have them on a track like this.
And of course, Vettel ended up winning Driver of the Day,
Yes.
voted by the fans, much well-deserved. And for our final poll, our final winner of the day, it's Checo. It's Sergio Perez, runner-up for Driver of the Day, went from P9 to P4 and held fastest lap of the race for quite a while, taking over from his teammate Max Verstappen, before eventually there was some late race fastest lap drama. And of course, Checo in P4 was able to challenge Lando Norris for that final podium spot, which is incredibly difficult to do given how well Lando's performed this season.
And I mean, he was under a second behind Lando for a lot of the race, which is crazy. Good for him. Next, we're moving on to our pit lanes. These are the biggest blunders we saw today. First and foremost, the elephant in the room, Charles Leclerc, did not race because of pre-race drama. So during qualifying, he actually crashed on the last lap, on his fastest lap. Everyone was really worried he would get a penalty because of his gearbox, because if he had to make changes to his gearbox, he was going to have a penalty. There was no issues with his gearbox. We all thought he was going to start fine. And now we find some other issues with this car that prevented him from even racing.
Yeah, during the warm-up lap, Ferrari engineers realized there was a problem with the drive shaft, which may or may not have even had to do with the crash.
Mm-hmm.
So really rough going for Charles Leclerc in his home Grand Prix, especially after qualifying pole position.
And Charles has never finished a Monaco race before.
And that streak continues.
The streak continues. Tune in next year, guys.
Hopefully he'll be able to get it done next year. Our next pit lane. Again, there were two very big storylines for this race. One of them we just covered, and the next was Valtteri Bottas and his infinitely long pit stop that ended up with him retiring the car and DNFing at Monaco. Mm-hmm. Bottas pulls into pit lane right alongside Vettel and Pierre Gasly, just before actually, and the engineers were unable to remove the front right tire from his car, just unable to get it off, no matter how hard they tried. Ended up that Bottas couldn't even leave the pit lane.
Yeah, had to retire the car. Really rough for him. I mean, no fault of his own. It's always hard when it's not the driver's fault, you know? You have to put your fate in everyone else's hands, and that's like a really interesting dynamic in Formula One because it feels like an individual sport, you know, but you actually have a whole team behind you creating these cars and maintaining them.
And despite his teammate Lewis Hamilton's struggles, Valtteri Bottas was on pace throughout qualifying and the early part of the race. He held strong to his P3.
Yeah, he was, once Charles wasn't able to race, that we had Max go into P1 and Valtteri in P2, and he most likely could have kept it.
It was certainly looking like it until that pit stop.
So our last pit lane is none other than Daniel Ricciardo. It's the biggest smile on the track, but I don't think that smile is pretty big today. Now, Ricciardo's had a really rough go with McLaren. He's been jumping around from various teams, and I think he's having some issue adjusting to the cars. You know, his teammate Lando has been in this car for a couple years now, just signed a multi-year contract. And I think that Daniel's still trying to get adjusted to how the car moves and everything. He was actually lapped by his teammate Lando, which is a rough sight to see. It's really rough when your teammate laps you. And it's become clear that Lando is a team favorite. You know, Ricciardo kind of hurt McLaren in the Constructors' Championship today, not getting those points. He finished P12, if I'm right?
P12, outside the points.
Yeah, P12, outside the points once again. He did have a good race in Spain. Well, good in the sense that he outqualified outperformed his teammate. But it still really isn't enough. And I'm hoping that in future races we can see a better performance from Ricciardo. It's really hard, too, because we know that Daniel Ricciardo loves Monaco, and he is a race winner at Monaco. So seeing him perform so poorly today is a rough sight.
It was really sad to see Ricciardo. If there was going to be a race where he performed well, it was going to be this one. It needed to be this one, I should say, coming off of the contract news with Lando Norris, and given that he's won at Monaco before, and also giving how incredible those McLaren cars looked on the track today. But no, he just couldn't put it together. And in a race where McLaren's biggest competition for third place in the Constructors' Cup is, of course, Ferrari. And with Ferrari's pole position driver not even racing, this was the time for Ricciardo to put together a damn good race, scoring some points and extending a lead. But instead, not only did he score outside the points, but Lando was defeated by Carlos Sainz.
Exactly.
Not what you want from McLaren.
Not to take away from Lando's win, which was big, and we'll get to that, or third place, but that's a win. But overall, it really did not did not do much to put McLaren ahead in the Constructors' Championship.
So next we are going to move on to the team recap segment. This team recap segment, we go through all 10 teams in the order of their highest placing driver, which means, of course, today we are starting with Red Bull. For the first time, of course, this is the first time doing this segment, but normally you would expect to see Mercedes at the top of this list. But here we have Red Bull. Red Bull was clearly the fastest car on the grid today, I think. I really don't think there was much debate about that.
I mean, consistently we got, you would see on the graphic, fastest lap, Max Verstappen, fastest lap, Sergio Perez. And there's no denying how fast those cars were and how maneuverable they were on all those corners.
Yeah, neither driver seemed to have much trouble with those tight corners of Monaco. Sergio was able to overtake many a driver going from P9 to P4, as we mentioned.
Next, we have Ferrari, the unsung heroes of the day, despite what happened with Charles. Of course, Carlos. We need to give Carlos some credit. He saved the day.
Round of applause.
Giving Ferrari those driver points and those constructor points that are very much needed, keeping them ahead of McLaren. And, I mean, I think that, it's kind of hard to see just how great Carlos did today because he wasn't really offensive, He did a lot of defense, but that's just as impressive. He held back everyone who tried to pass him and stayed pretty close to Max Verstappen the whole time, and we know that Max is a bullet. And of course, shout out to Carlos for getting his first Ferrari podium.
Yes, indeed.
Very exciting.
It was really nice to see a red Ferrari placing high in Monaco. It just felt right.
Historic. And especially after Ferrari had kind of a bad go last year.
Yeah. Next up, we have McLaren with Lando Norris placing P3 after qualifying P5. Great race from him. I'd say for about the middle of the race, we had a team radio segment in which he was audibly worried about the state of his car and the state of his tires, but despite that, he managed to fend off Sergio Perez and hold on to that last podium spot, which is his first podium at Monaco and his third as an F1 driver. Of course, we mentioned Daniel Ricciardo and his less than inspiring performance, but all in all, this was a good day for McLaren.
And while we're on the subject of McLaren, can we talk about how cute Lando and Carlos's bromance was on the podium? Oh, it's so great seeing the two former teammates, current best friends, being on the podium, succeeding alongside each other. It's just so great to see.
We, at least, were rooting for both Carlos and Lando to be on the podium
and
from the beginning of the race.
Next, that brings us to Aston Martin, formerly Racing Point, formerly Force India. Who knows what they'll be called next year. So like we said, Seb is back. It's so great to see this former world champion back, competitive, fighting in the midfield.
P5.
Yeah, I mean, crazy. And even Stroll, who we, aren't afraid to say isn't our favorite Aston Martin driver, but props to him because he went from P13 to P8 on a Monaco track, which is a very hard track to overtake on, as we keep saying. And also, he scored some points for the team, which is great. Also, we have to mention Stroll's flying Mario Kart bit, where he went over the curve, and it looked like in Mario Kart when you go over the ramps. Didn't shake his controller, though. Didn't get the boost, sadly.
And another thing it didn't do was alert the FIA. I mean, they had a short investigation into Stroll to see if he had broken any rules coming out of a pit lane, but there ended up being no penalty points. Stroll's move was legal, and it was a great day for Aston Martin.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on now to AlphaTauri and Pierre Gasly, friend of the show, we hope to one day say.
Oh, yes.
Pierre Gasly is one of our favorite drivers personally, and again, you mentioned with Carlos having a very defensive race, that was Gasly to a T.
Oh,
he did not make up any points, but he sure as hell didn't lose any, and when you have Lewis Hamilton right on your behind the whole race, that's an incredibly impressive feat.
Yeah, I mean, he started P6, ended P6, kept a 7-time world champion behind him the whole time.
That's a really impressive day for Pierre Gasly. And of course, we do have to bring up, he was overtaken by Vettel in that pit lane exit, but it was a really good pit stop for Gasly. He likely would have overtaken Bottas had Bottas come out of the pit lane.
And again, we can't blame Gasly for the pit stops.
Of course not.
And it's 3 seconds slow compared to, Red Bull's 1.9 pit stop, but still impressive.
Another thing we have to mention with AlphaTauri is Gasly's teammate Yuki Tsunoda, who started on the hard tires, pitted very late, and then all of a sudden, we're watching the race, and we see a purple icon flash in the bottom of our screen, and it says, the graphic on the top popped up, and it said, Yuki Tsunoda fastest lap. And when I say our jaws dropped, did not see that coming.
No, not at all. He was in like P16 or something.
16 or 17 at that point.
Like, driving fast. I guess he had clean air or something, but good for Yuki Tsunoda.
Showing a little promise. And I mean, he's, had a bit of a rough start to the year. He's a rookie, learning the ropes, getting acclimated, but that shows some serious promise.
Exactly. Next we have Mercedes, which, again, why are we taking so long to talk about them? Hamilton had a very conservative weekend overall, which is very unusual for him. He was slow during the practices, he was slow during qualifying, and then again in the race, didn't lose any spots, didn't gain any spots. Stayed in P7, which, if we were talking about Lance Stroll, maybe we would say, oh, it's a pretty good race, but for a seven-time world champion, it's kind of hard to see. Apparently, he had issues with warming up his tires, which is why he wasn't able to maybe cut corners as much. And again, Monaco's such a unique track that it makes sense that maybe not every car would perform its best. Also to mention, Hamilton had the fastest lap, so despite his P7 finish, he did gain that one extra point, which in the end can be make or break with such a close race. Max is now only 1 point ahead of Hamilton.
Red Bull is only 1 point ahead of Mercedes.
Mercedes, yes, you're right. So every point counts.
Every point does count. And we mentioned Bottas, and my God, that pit stop was hard to watch. You really had to feel
you just
Bottas.
on the graphics, you just saw his name drop and drop and drop.
And with Bottas in the final year of his contract with Mercedes, it's beginning to become harder and harder to imagine that marriage staying strong moving forward.
Hard to justify it.
Yeah, and through the fault, I think, of both parties. Bottas has struggled a bit in earlier races, and now you see Mercedes' side starting to struggle to uphold Bottas and play to his strengths. Moving on from Mercedes, we now have Alpine.
Formerly Renault.
Formerly Renault, yeah. Alpine was honestly a bit of a boring team to watch today. Fernando Alonso qualified very poorly, I believe P17, not even making it out of Q1, and he didn't do a whole lot better in the race. I mean, I'm looking at my notes now, and Alonso finished P13, which, fair enough, good for him, but still, outside the points, was lapped a whole bunch. But Esteban Ocon, we have to talk about. Esteban Ocon, I believe, qualified P11, yes? Outside the points for sure. Worked his way up into 9th place, secured 2 points, and managed to turn a bad day into an okay one.
And we've seen a very surprisingly strong performance from Ocon this whole year so far. I mean, the last couple of races he's been qualifying super high, and I think that he can do some promising things for Alpine throughout the rest of the races.
And that's the sign of a driver who belongs, I think. When they're able to take a situation around them that is obviously less than ideal and make something good out of it. He managed to manufacture some points, save the day for Alpine at least a little bit, you know?
And, I mean, just an interesting dichotomy having this more of a new, I wouldn't call him a rookie, he's been here for a couple years, but having this newer driver pitted against Fernando Alonso, who is, of course, a world championship. So, interesting pairing. That brings us to Alfa Romeo, the Ferrari B team. So, like we mentioned, Antonio Giovinazzi, P10, his best qualifying so far, ended P10. So, no places gained, no places lost, but he got that point, which is the first point that Alfa Romeo has won this year so far.
Congratulations to them.
Kimi Räikkönen, everyone's favorite old-timer. Started P14, went down to P11, so gained a few places. Didn't make it into the points, but again, nice battle for P10 a little bit. There was a period where we thought Kimi was going to get some points. And at this point, I just like seeing Kimi on the track. He doesn't even have to gain points.
Exactly. There was, throughout the pitting, I guess, middle section of the race where drivers were starting to pit, there was a period of time where both Giovinazzi and Räikkönen were inside the back half of the top 10, and there was a legitimate chance that both of them could have finished with points for Alfa Romeo. Of course, it didn't end up happening, but a good day for the team nonetheless. Now we move on to Williams in their 750th race as a team. Congratulations to Williams. And that's kind of about all we can say about Williams. They've struggled mightily this season. George Russell, as we said during the race, George Russell, your day will come. He had trouble overtaking his teammate Latifi. He did end up finishing higher than Latifi did in the race, but for a while, Russell was down there with the Haas drivers at the bottom of the grid, and it's just disheartening to see.
It's
a driver
hard to
so
see.
talented.
Yeah, like we said, we know that George Russell has talent, and he is a reserve driver for Mercedes, which is, and that in its own proves that he has some chops. You know, it's really sad because Williams was a world champion team, you know, back in the day, and to have such a momentous race kind of not be very underwhelming is sad to see. The thing, Brady, you had said that they've been struggling this year, and yes, they have. Williams has been struggling for the last couple years, but I will say, Williams has been struggling less. Wanna know why? Because there's a new bad boy on the block.
There is a new bad boy on the block.
And bad meaning bad.
Bad meaning not good. Why don't you talk
and
about
that
it?
is Haas.
Oh.
Led by Gunther Steiner. Exciting news for Haas today. Both drivers finished.
Is that the first time this season that both drivers have finished?
I think there was maybe one or two other races, but there's been a lot of DNFs on the part of Haas. Mazepin finished
Nikita Mazepin
ahead of Mick Schumacher, which is, I think, a first for him.
Yeah.
And didn't end up in the water.
Listen, I said at the beginning of the race that this was my hot take going into Monaco, and I've been spouting this nonsense all weekend, so anyone can verify it, anybody that I know. I said all weekend that Nikita Mazepin was not going to be the final driver to finish the race. I figured there might be a couple DNFs at Monaco, and there ended up being for not the reasons that I thought, but I said not only will Nikita Mazepin finish the race, but he will finish the race ahead of another driver who finishes the race. And that is exactly what happens. He outperforms his teammate, Mick Schumacher. And although each Haas car was lapped three times, Mazepin did defeat his teammate. He extends his streak of never placing lower in a race than he has in qualifying. That streak stands.
Indeed. And didn't have any blue flag penalties.
No.
None at all. Especially, honestly, on a track like Monaco where it's so tight and narrow. Good for Mazepin. If he was going to have any blue flag penalties, it would be on this track. And I think he's learned from his mistakes. I think Gunther Steiner maybe pulled him into a room and had a stern word with him about those penalties.
Our good friend Gunther Steiner. And yeah, Mazepin, the only brush with trouble that he encountered, of course, besides performing poorly in the race, was he did get a checkered warning flag for exceeding track limits, but there were no penalty points.
And he wasn't the only one. We got a checkered flag, or not checkered,
black and white flag
for Lando Norris too, who didn't end up getting penalized. And then of course we had that whole stint where Lance Stroll got investigated.
Can we talk about that, actually? The lack of flags in this race.
Yeah, starting the race, the broadcast announcers said that in the last 10 years, 9 races had a yellow flag, at least, or a red flag. We had none of that. We did have 2 DNFs, a lot of stuff that happened, but that didn't actually impact the track itself.
There were no crashes during the race. No crashes. So, congratulations to all the drivers. We love our drivers safe. And that's the end of our team recap segment for the Monaco Grand Prix.
Next, we have the best team radio moment. This is where we're going to talk about our favorite little radio moments between driver and team, because sometimes those can get a little fun. And
this is the team radio podcast, after all.
Yeah. And this one, it's maybe not 1, it's 2.
We've got 2. The first off, we mentioned earlier, but Lando Norris, towards the end of the race, was beginning to get a little stressed out. He was in P3, Sergio Perez was gaining on him from P4, and he was worried about the performance of his car. There was a moment during the team radio segment where he was exchanging, we'll say, heated or emotionally charged words.
Emotionally charged, not heated.
Not heated, emotionally charged words with his engineer.
Yeah, he was worried about his engine, I think, and the engineers told him to try to conserve fuel. Ultimately, didn't impact him at all.
Yeah. An impressive performance by Lando there. And then would you like to talk about our other team radio clip?
Our other team radio, we like it because it's a fun juxtaposition to Lando. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but it's just Max chilling. Max Verstappen phones in on the radio and goes, "These tires are feeling good." Engineer says, "Understood, thank you," and that's all.
During the broadcast, especially during the team radio parts of the broadcast, you hear a lot of worried drivers. You hear a lot of, "These tires are no good. I'm worried about the engine. The gearbox doesn't feel great. I think I may have exceeded track limits, blah, 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 blah." So it was pretty refreshing to see Max Verstappen, race leader, just having a good time.
Yeah, especially after, the last couple of races he's had where it's been really hard to try to beat Lewis Hamilton. His other win of the season was the wet race at Imola.
Yes.
And he was 20 seconds ahead on that race. So I guess when Max wins, Max wins.
Yeah, yes, indeed. He likes to build up those big leads. And although Carlos kept it close, there was really no doubt from the beginning who was going to take home the win. Finally, let's move on to our last segment of the episode, my personal favorite. This is the Monaco Grand Prix Drive to Survive moment of the day, in which we highlight the most impactful moment of the race. The one that we think will be highlighted in Netflix's
Drive
series.
to Survive in a very dramatic way.
In very dramatic
music
fashion.
and editing and all.
Honestly, there was a bit of a competition for this moment, but we elected to go with the moment that happened during the Grand Prix and not prior to it, so we picked Valtteri Bottas's pit stop and the disaster that unfolded for Mercedes.
Calling it now, there is going to be a shot that cuts to Toto Wolff slamming a table.
I sure hope so.
Running his hands through his hair.
Toto Wolff is a very animated character, and we love him for it. He's very passionate about the job. Well, that's all that we have for the first episode of the Team Radio podcast. Once again, my name is Brady.
And I'm Merritt.
Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next race.
Beep, beep.